Have you ever been treated as if you were invisible, like your presence, your dignity, didn't matter? Now imagine you're standing at an airport gate, carrying nothing but a small briefcase filled with personal notes. You followed every rule, waited your turn, stayed calm. But the gate agent singles you out, raises her voice, and strips you of your dignity in front of strangers. You have two choices: argue and risk humiliation, or walk away in silence. But what if that ordinary passenger was not ordinary at all? What if he was a federal judge, a man who held the future of the very airline that just disrespected him in his courtroom the next day? What would you do if the quiet man you dismissed held your career, your company, and your reputation in the palm of his hand? And more importantly, what would you hope he did with that power? Tonight, we're diving into a story of arrogance, humility, and justice delivered in the most unexpected way. A story that asks all of us, how do you treat people when you think they are powerless? If this resonates, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. Newark Liberty International Airport on a weekday morning was a place where time felt both stretched and compressed. Travelers streamed through the wide concourses, dragging roller bags that rattled over the polished tile floors. The smell of burnt coffee drifted out from a crowded kiosk, competing with the sugary warmth of cinnamon rolls baking behind glass. Announcements echoed from the loudspeakers' gate changes, final boarding calls each overlapping like a chorus of impatient voices. To most people, it was just another hectic morning in one of the busiest airports in the country. But for one man sitting quietly at gate B42 this day would become a turning point not just for him, but for the airline whose planes roared across the sky overhead. Malcolm Rivers looked, at first glance, like any other weary traveler. He was in his mid-60s, a tall black man with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of posture that carried its own authority even when he was seated. He wore a navy blue polo shirt, khaki slacks, and a pair of well-worn loafers that had molded to his stride over decades of use. In his lap rested an old leather briefcase, the edges scuffed, the handle softened by years of carrying. The briefcase wasn't expensive or flashy, but it was precious. It had been a gift from his late wife, Claire, given on the day he signed the papers to acquire his first company. Malcolm had once been a high-profile CEO, building a logistics empire from the ground up, a rare black executive in boardrooms that often lacked diversity. In recent years, he had stepped away from day-to-day operations, turning his focus to philanthropy and serving on federal commissions. His influence remained quiet but immense, shaped by decades of navigating power structures that didn't always welcome him. This morning, though, he wasn't here as a businessman or philanthropist. He was simply a man traveling to Philadelphia to deliver a keynote address at his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania Law School. The lecture was meant to inspire the next generation of lawyers and business leaders to embrace dignity and integrity in their work. He had spent weeks refining his speech, weaving in personal stories of resilience and lessons learned in the face of discrimination. The manuscript lay neatly inside the old briefcase resting against his leg. To pass the time before boarding, Malcolm read from a thick hardcover book on political philosophy. The words absorbed him, but not in a way that blocked out the world. His gift was the ability to be still and observant, to notice without intruding, to listen without judging too quickly. His colleagues used to joke that he had the patience of a stone, though those who knew him well understood that patience came from years of choosing dignity over retaliation. At gate B42, the boarding area buzzed with the familiar rituals of air travel. A young couple wrangled a stroller, struggling to collapse it for gate check. A businessman barked into his phone, his voice carrying farther than he realized. Two college students shared earbuds, laughing at a video only they could hear. Malcolm glanced up occasionally, his gaze soft, his thoughts more inward than outward. He had grown accustomed to blending in and letting assumptions work in his favor. People rarely recognized him outside the boardroom or news articles. To strangers, he was just another traveler, an older black man with a worn briefcase, waiting for his boarding group to be called. That anonymity suited him. It allowed him to move through spaces without the baggage of expectations, without the weight of his title. Still, there were moments when he felt the ache of invisibility. He had spent a lifetime proving himself against the quiet undertow of doubt cast by others' doubt about his capability, his leadership, even his humanity. The airport was a microcosm of that world status announced through boarding groups, upgrades, and elite access. Everyone had their place, and not all places were treated equally. When the loudspeaker crackled to announce the start of pre-boarding, Malcolm slipped a bookmark into his philosophy text and closed it with care. His boarding pass listed Group 3. He preferred to board later, avoiding the claustrophobic shuffle down the jet bridge and the awkward dance of competing for overhead bin space. For now, he remained seated, watching the stream of passengers line up. The gate agent on duty, a young woman named Kelly Monroe, projected the brisk efficiency of someone who saw herself as the final arbiter of order. Her smile, practiced and professional, flickered on and off as she scanned boarding passes and waved customers forward. She barely glanced at Malcolm when her eyes swept across the waiting area. To her, he was part of the scenery, another face in the crowd. Malcolm adjusted the strap on his briefcase and exhaled softly, feeling a twinge in his lower back. It was an old injury from long days hunched at conference tables and long nights of restless sleep. He reminded himself that once this trip was over, he would finally take the vacation his daughter had been urging him to plan. A week in the Carolinas, perhaps warm air, quiet mornings, no gate agents, no overhead announcements, just peace. For now. Though, peace was hard to come by. The line at gate B42 inched forward, and soon enough it would be his turn to step up. He had no idea that the moments ahead would unravel into a confrontation that would ripple far beyond this terminal, reaching into corporate boardrooms and federal courtrooms alike. What he did know, sitting there with his weathered briefcase and calm demeanor, was that dignity mattered in every interaction, whether with CEOs or cashiers, judges or gate agents. He carried himself with a quiet conviction. Respect should not have to be earned by status. It should be given freely, as the baseline of human decency. It was a conviction soon to be tested in the most humiliating and ultimately consequential way imaginable. The loudspeaker popped again, and the voice of Kelly Monroe carried across the waiting area. Now boarding Group 3 for Flight Apex, 227 to Philadelphia. Please have your boarding passes and identification ready. Malcolm Rivers rose slowly, stretching his back before lifting his briefcase and small carry-on. The two bags were modest compared to the oversized duffels and designer luggage he had watched passengers wheel aboard. He stepped into line, his expression calm, his movements deliberate. The queue shuffled forward, inch by inch. Kelly smiled at each traveler, a mechanical grin, scanning their passes with an efficient beep. When Malcolm reached the podium, he handed over his driver's license and digital boarding pass, already open on his phone. Beep. Then a second, sharper beep. The screen glowed red. Kelly's smile vanished. She frowned at the monitor, then at Malcolm. Her voice clipped and cool. "Sir, there's a problem with your ticket." Malcolm adjusted his glasses. His tone even, "Oh, I wasn't aware of any issue." Kelly tapped furiously on her keyboard, her nails clicking against the plastic keys. "The system has flagged your seat. Looks like we had to reassign for weight and balance. I'll print you a new boarding pass." "That's fine," Malcolm said. He had been through enough flights to know such changes weren't uncommon. His voice carried no irritation, no impatience. Kelly pressed a button, and the printer spit out a slip of paper. She held it out, almost triumphantly. "Here you go. Seat 34B, middle seat." Malcolm glanced at the new ticket. He had originally been assigned 12C, an aisle seat with legroom. Now he was being pushed nearly to the back of the plane. Still, he didn't argue. "Very well," he said, sliding the paper into his pocket. But Kelly didn't hand back his ID. Instead, her eyes flicked down to his briefcase and carry on. "Sir," she said, her tone tightening, "you've got 2 bags there." "Yes," Malcolm replied patiently. "One carry-on and 1 personal item, as your airline policy allows." Her lips pressed thin. "That briefcase is too large to be considered a personal item." Malcolm followed her gaze. The case was no larger than the oversized purses he'd seen pass through, smaller, even, than the stuffed backpack the college student before him had carried. He spoke gently. "I assure you, it fits under the seat. I've flown with it dozens of times on this airline." Kelly's eyes narrowed. She jabbed a finger at the case. "Policy has changed for safety reasons. That bag must be consolidated or checked." A ripple of unease moved through the line behind him. People shifted, impatient, eager to board. Malcolm kept his tone low, steady. "I can't check it. It contains documents and electronics. Personal materials I cannot let out of my possession." "Then consolidate," Kelly shot back, raising her voice just enough for others to hear. "Put everything into one bag, or you won't be boarding." Malcolm glanced around. He saw the man with the oversized duffel already seated at the gate. He saw a woman breeze by with 2 shopping bags in addition to her suitcase. The rule, it seemed, applied only to him. He inhaled slowly, centering himself. Years in boardrooms had taught him the value of restraint. Still, something inside him tightened. The quiet sting of being singled out again in public was familiar, but no less painful for its familiarity. "Perhaps you could show me the written dimensions of a personal item," he asked politely, "so I can understand how this briefcase violates them." Kelly flushed. His calmness was not the surrender she expected. To her, it was a challenge. "Sir, I don't have time to debate policy with you. You're holding up the line. Check the bag or step aside." The passengers behind Malcolm grew restless. A sigh here, a muttered complaint there. The pressure of the crowd leaned against him, urging him to yield. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes on his back. "I am not trying to be difficult," Malcolm said evenly, "but I do believe this is unreasonable." Kelly folded her arms, her voice rising another notch. "You think the rules don't apply to you?" The words struck harder than she intended. To her, it was a line of authority. To Malcolm, it was the echo of a lifetime of prejudice, an insinuation he had fought against since the beginning of his career. The irony was bitter. A man who had built his life on respecting rules, accused now of flouting them over a briefcase. The tension thickened. Conversations around the gate quieted. Passengers were watching openly now, some frowning at Kelly's tone, others silently wishing the delay would end. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice dropped softer, almost a whisper. "There's no need to raise your voice. Let's just be reasonable." But Kelly was no longer listening. In her eyes, this wasn't about policy. It was about power. "Sir," she snapped, "you either consolidate or you're not getting on this plane." The line of travelers shifted again. Impatience hummed in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to whine, tugging at a parent's arm. Malcolm stood still, breathing in deeply. He had faced hostile investors, skeptical boards, even racially charged challenges to his leadership. But something about this moment being dressed down by a gate agent over a briefcase cut deeper than the others. It was small, almost petty, and yet it carried the same undertone, "You don't belong here." He thought of his late wife, Claire, and the words she used to calm him in moments like this, "Mal. You don't have to fight every battle. Some you win just by walking away with dignity." His fingers brushed the worn handle of the briefcase. It grounded him. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," he said at last, offering her a path to save face. But Kelly's eyes hardened. She crossed her arms. "My supervisor will tell you the same thing. I know the policy. You are failing to comply." Her words carried like a gavel strike across the gate area. Malcolm realized the confrontation wasn't ending here. It was only escalating. And with that escalation, the quiet seed of humiliation began to grow. The tension at Gate B42 had thickened to the point of silence. Every rustle of a boarding pass, every impatient sigh from the line behind Malcolm Rivers seemed amplified. Kelly Monroe stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. She had dug her heels in, unwilling to yield an inch. Then, as if summoned by the rising pressure, a man appeared from the side corridor, a slightly older employee in a dark Apex Air jacket. His name tag read Frank Doyle, supervisor. Frank carried himself with the weary swagger of someone who spent his career marinating in complaints. His face bore the lines of cynicism more than age, and his eyes darted between Kelly and Malcolm with the impatience of a man who believed he'd already solved the problem before hearing it. "What's the issue here?" Frank asked. His voice edged with irritation, not curiosity. Kelly straightened, her voice sharpening with relief. "This passenger is refusing to comply with the baggage policy. He has 2 oversized items, and he won't check 1. Frank barely glanced at Malcolm. His eyes did a quick sweep: polo shirt, slacks, weathered briefcase, no elite tag on the carry-on, no premium boarding pass in hand, just another economy traveler slowing down his gait. "Sir," Frank said, his tone dripping with condescension, "the policy is clear. 1 carry-on, 1 personal item. That briefcase is too big for a personal item. We can check it here at the gate. For a fee, of course," Malcolm added evenly, already anticipating the reply. Frank smirked, confirming the suspicion without shame. $75. Standard gate check charge. A flicker of murmurs rippled through the line. Some passengers exchanged looks. $75 for a bag, but no one spoke aloud. They just wanted to get on the plane. Malcolm stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "This bag complies with your stated policy. I will not pay to check it, and I cannot surrender it. It contains personal documents and a speech manuscript I need tomorrow morning." Frank exhaled heavily, rolling his eyes as if he had heard every excuse in the book. "A speech," he muttered, the word wrapped in skepticism. "Look, pal, I don't have time for this. You're holding up the line and delaying the flight. That's a federal offense, in case you didn't know." The absurdity of the threat hung in the air. A man who had spent decades shaping corporate law and advising governments was now being warned, falsely, that he was committing a federal crime for standing with his briefcase. Malcolm felt the heat of humiliation rise. Though his face remained composed, inside, though, his thoughts wrestled. Do I fight this battle? Do I assert who I am, what authority I carry, or do I let it pass? Hold on to the dignity they can't take from me? He remembered Claire again, her voice like a bomb. Not every fight is worth your energy. Mal, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to walk away. But Frank wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice lowering into a growl that only Malcolm could hear. Here are your choices. Check the bag, leave it behind, or I'll call airport security to escort you out. What's it going to be? The words landed like a slap. Malcolm didn't flinch, but he felt the insult in his bones. He had spent a lifetime in rooms where respect had to be earned 3 times over before it was given once. Yet here, in this fluorescent-lit corner of Newark Liberty, he wasn't even afforded the courtesy of being seen as a person, just a problem to be removed. The passengers behind him shifted again, restless. A man coughed loudly, muttering something about missing connections. A woman clutched her child's hand tighter, whispering, "Almost there. Honey." The collective impatience pressed down on Malcolm like a physical weight. He could argue. He could demand to see the written policy, ask for a corporate representative, even call a contact in the airline's executive office. But to what end he would miss his flight, lose his chance to deliver the keynote on time, and still be painted as the difficult passenger. So he chose, with slow, deliberate grace. Malcolm straightened his shoulders and stepped back from the podium. His voice was calm, measured, the way a judge might pronounce a verdict. You've made your position clear. You are refusing to honor my ticket and denying me passage. Frank smirked, thinking he had won. No, he countered, loud enough for the crowd to hear. You're refusing to comply. It's your choice. Malcolm paused, his gaze steady. He saw no malice in Frank's eyes, no personal hatred. What he saw was something far more ordinary, and perhaps more dangerous, the dull certainty of a man clinging to a small kingdom of power, blind to the humanity in front of him. Very well, Malcolm said softly. He lifted his carry-on, gripped the handle of his weathered briefcase, and turned away. His retreat was not hurried or ashamed. It was slow, dignified, deliberate. And in that silence, the silence of a man refusing to be diminished, there was more condemnation than any raised voice could have delivered. The boarding line held its breath. Even Frank and Kelly blinked, momentarily thrown off by the quiet strength of the exit. As Malcolm walked down the concourse, the fluorescent lights glinting off the polished tiles, he passed 2 men rushing in the opposite direction. Both wore impeccably tailored suits, carrying sleek briefcases that screamed wealth and privilege. They laughed as they jogged toward the gate, one glancing at his watch. "Richard, we're cutting it close." The older one chuckled. "They wouldn't dare leave without Apex Air's legal team." The younger replied with a grin. They swept past Malcolm without a second glance, their polished shoes clicking briskly against the floor. To them, he was invisible, just another passenger walking away in defeat. Behind them, the gate agent's smile returned, warm and dazzling, as she welcomed them aboard. Malcolm kept walking, his steps steady, his heart heavy but unbroken. What Frank and Kelly didn't know, what Richard Coleman and his young associate Emily Carter didn't bother to notice, was that the man they had dismissed, humiliated, and forced away from gate B42 was not just another traveler. He was the very judge presiding over the lawsuit that could determine the fate of Apex Air itself. The concourse at Newark Liberty seemed endless. Malcolm Rivers walked with measured steps, his 2 bags in hand. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. To anyone passing by, he might have looked like an ordinary man who had simply missed his flight. But those who had witnessed the exchange at Gate B42 felt something else linger in the air, the sharp silence of injustice unspoken, the kind that burns hotter precisely because it never erupts. Malcolm's retreat was still unfolding when 2 men swept past him, their laughter sharp against the quiet he carried. They moved like they owned the floor beneath their polished shoes. Both wore bespoke suits that hugged their frames perfectly, the kind of tailoring that cost more than some people's monthly rent. Their briefcases gleamed with new leather and brass fittings, more status symbol than practical tool. The older of the 2, Richard Coleman, adjusted his tie with the easy confidence of someone used to doors opening before he even reached them. He was Apex Air's star partner from the prestigious firm of Coleman and Myers, a man who thrived on corporate battles and whose name carried weight in boardrooms. Beside him, slightly behind, but trying hard to match his stride, was Emily Carter. She was younger, mid-30s, her suit just as crisp but her energy tighter, more anxious. A rising associate at the firm, she had been chosen to accompany Richard not just for her sharp mind, but because she was dependable, a pair of steady hands to manage the mountain of documents, case law, and digital files that Richard rarely bothered to touch himself. "Can you believe the traffic?" Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "If we'd hit one more red light, we'd have missed pre-boarding entirely." Emily quickened her steps, clutching her tablet. "We still have time." "Richard, they won't close the gate before the company's own lawyers board." Richard smirked. "Exactly. They wouldn't dare." Their voices carried down the concourse, cutting into the silence that Malcolm had left behind. He heard them, though they didn't look at him. They didn't even register his presence. To them, he was no more than background scenery, another passenger moving in the opposite direction. The sting of their laughter pricked at Malcolm's composure, but he didn't falter. He'd lived too many years in boardrooms where similar laughter had been used as a shield, as a weapon, as a dismissal. He had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of power. Richard and Emily, however, carried none of that silence. They approached Gate B42 with the unhurried entitlement of those who never feared being turned away. Kelly Monroe spotted them immediately. Her posture shifted. The tension that had stiffened her shoulders during the confrontation with Malcolm softened into a practiced warmth. The smile that had disappeared minutes ago bloomed back onto her face, bright and deferential. "Good morning, gentlemen," she greeted, though her eyes lingered a fraction longer on Richard. "You're just in time. May I see your boarding passes?" Richard handed over his first-class pass with a flourish, like a man presenting proof of royalty. Emily followed suit, quieter, her eyes darting briefly toward the empty space where Malcolm had stood only moments ago. She had seen the tail end of the dispute from a distance, catching only the rise in Kelly's voice and the stiff set of Malcolm's shoulders as he walked away. Something about it had unsettled her. Kelly scanned their passes. The machine beeped green. She returned them with a smile that could have been mistaken for admiration. "Right this way. Welcome aboard." Richard winked at Emily as he strode down the jet bridge. "Told you. Never a problem when you're flying on the company dime." Emily forced a smile, but her thoughts tugged elsewhere. That man walking away there had been a gravity about him, a kind of quiet dignity that didn't match the image of a troublemaker she'd expected from Kelly's raised voice. She brushed the thought aside. There was no time for distractions. They had a case to win, and every ounce of her focus was needed for the courtroom ahead. Inside the first-class cabin, Richard slid easily into his wide leather seat, stretching out like a king reclaiming his throne. A flight attendant appeared almost instantly, offering champagne. He accepted without hesitation, raising the glass as though in toast to his own brilliance. Emily sat across the aisle, placing her tablet neatly on the tray table. She pulled up her notes, scanning line after line of deposition summaries and case law. The weight of the lawsuit pressed on her more heavily than on Richard. For him, it was another performance, another chance to flex his ego. For her, it was a proving ground one mistake and her career trajectory could veer sharply downward. "Relax, Emily," Richard said, swirling the champagne in his glass. "This is a slam dunk. Rivers is old school. He'll side with us. The contract says what it says. End of story." "Judge Rivers has a reputation," Emily replied carefully, not looking up. "He's observant. Known for being independent. They call him the Sphinx. Remember? He doesn't miss details." Richard chuckled. "Every judge has a reputation. In the end, it's about the law, not feelings. Our terms are airtight. He'll see that." Emily hesitated, the image of Malcolm's retreat flickering again in her mind. His back straight, his step steady, the quiet power in the way he carried himself. It didn't feel like the walk of a defeated man. It felt like something else. Richard, oblivious, leaned back, closing his eyes. "Besides," he added with a smirk, "did you see that guy at the gate? Arguing with the agent like the fate of the world rested on his little briefcase? People really think a ticket makes them king." Emily looked up sharply. "You mean the man who walked away?" Richard shrugged. "Yeah, what a scene. Some people just love to make trouble." Emily didn't respond. She remembered the man's eyes, steady and calm, even as the agent's voice rose. Trouble wasn't what she'd seen. She had seen something closer to resignation, a quiet refusal to stoop lower. But Richard was already done with the subject. He slipped on his noise-canceling headphones, effectively sealing himself off from further discussion. Emily returned to her tablet, though the words blurred before her. That man. That moment it gnawed at her, though she couldn't explain why. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a faint alarm bell rang, soft but insistent. Back in the concourse, Malcolm found a quieter corner of the terminal. He lowered himself into a seat, resting his bags by his feet. From here, he could see the planes taxiing outside, silver birds glinting in the morning light. He wasn't angry. Anger was too costly, too corrosive. But he was thoughtful, deeply thoughtful. In his mind, the small scene at Gate B42 replayed itself, not as an isolated annoyance, but as a telling fragment of something larger. The arrogance, the dismissiveness, the selective enforcement of rules. It wasn't about one gate agent or one supervisor. It was a symptom of a culture. And as a man who had built companies, as a man who understood the DNA of institutions, Malcolm knew that culture always revealed itself most clearly in the smallest interactions. He would remember this moment, not out of spite, but out of observation. He had always believed that the true character of a company wasn't written in mission statements or annual reports. It was revealed in the way its lowest-level employees treated the people who had no power. As Richard Coleman and Emily Carter settled into their comfortable seats, sipping champagne high above the clouds, Malcolm Rivers sat quietly in the terminal, waiting for the next flight to Philadelphia. One man carried the smug confidence of privilege, The other carried the steady dignity of experience. Their paths had brushed past one another briefly, like ships in a harbor. What none of them yet realized was that those paths were set to collide again, this time in a courtroom where the stakes were measured not in boarding passes, but in hundreds of millions of dollars and the reputation of an entire airline. The jet bridge smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant, the scent of hundreds of rushed boardings compressed into its narrow corridor. Richard Coleman walked with the swagger of a man convinced that no door would ever close on him. His polished shoes clicked on the floor as though they owned it. Emily Carter followed, balancing her tablet, case files, and a gnawing unease that she tried to push down. Inside the first-class cabin, the air felt different, softer, perfumed with citrus and leather polish. Wide seats stretched out in elegant rows, already dotted with passengers sipping orange juice or champagne. Richard dropped into his seat with theatrical satisfaction, leaning back as though the world had finally resumed its proper orbit. Now this, he said, stretching his arms, is how air travel is meant to be. Emily slid into the seat across the aisle, setting her bag carefully under the seat in front of her. She powered up her tablet, the blue glow washing over her face. She scrolled through deposition summaries, but the words blurred. Her mind wandered back to the gate, to the older black man who had walked away with such deliberate calm. Richard noticed her distraction. He snapped his fingers toward the flight attendant who appeared promptly, smiling. "Champagne. Please, make it cold." He turned back to Emily. "You're too tense. Relax. This case is already won." Emily shook her head lightly. "It's not that simple. Judge Rivers is predictable." Richard interrupted. He swirled the champagne when it arrived, lifting it to the light. "Old school type. He respects contracts, and contracts are on our side. Let the plaintiffs cry about feelings. We have the law." Emily tapped her stylus against the screen, forcing herself to focus. "He's known for being exacting. They call him the Sphinx. He doesn't reveal his thinking until he has to. I've read transcripts. He has a way of asking one question that undoes an entire argument." Richard chuckled. Dismissive. Every judge has their theatrics. But at the end of the day, business is business, and Apex Air's policies are ironclad. The seatbelt sign pinged overhead. Passengers settled in as the plane taxied. Emily tried to bury herself in notes, but her concentration kept unraveling. She thought again of the man at the gate, the briefcase in his hand, the way he refused to raise his voice even as the agent's tone sharpened. Trouble wasn't what she'd seen. She'd seen composure, dignity. The engines roared, pressing them into their seats as the plane lifted from the tarmac. Lights of Newark flickered below before dissolving into a quilt of clouds. Richard leaned across the aisle, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You know what I love about these cases? The plaintiffs always think they're the underdogs in some moral crusade. They forget that the system favors the ones who can afford the best lawyers. Us." Emily didn't respond. She scribbled a note on her tablet. "Judge Rivers, be prepared for pointed ethical questions." Richard sipped more champagne. "It'll be a quick fight. We'll walk in, dazzle the court, and walk out with a win. Then dinner on the company's tab." His confidence was a shield, thick and impenetrable. Emily, however, felt hers cracking. She thought again of the plaintiff's ordinary passengers who had been nickel-and-dimed, sometimes humiliated by arbitrary airline fees. She thought of the man at the gate, walking away under the gaze of a crowd. Something about his silence unsettled her more than any shouted protest could have. The flight attendant passed by with a tray of hot towels. Richard accepted his with a grin, pressing it theatrically to his face. Emily declined, too deep in her reading. Her notes highlighted past rulings. Rivers siding with workers against corporate shortcuts. Rivers insisting on transparency and settlements. Rivers reprimanding lawyers who disrespected witnesses. His reputation wasn't built on sentimentality. It was built on precision and on a deep, almost stubborn belief that dignity mattered in the law. Emily's chest tightened. She could almost feel the weight of his unseen eyes on their case. Across the aisle, Richard had already reclined, headphones slipping over his ears, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He lived in a world where obstacles dissolved before him, where status opened doors and silenced questions. Emily envied his ease, but she didn't share it. Somewhere in her gut, she felt the tectonic plates of the case shifting. Something about the man at the gate, the man Richard had mocked so casually, was nagging at her. She couldn't explain why. The flight hummed on, the cabin filled with the clink of glasses and the rustle of newspapers. Outside, the clouds parted briefly, revealing the stretch of land below, rivers cutting like silver threads across the earth. Emily looked out, searching for clarity, but all she found was reflection, the reflection of her own uneasy face in the glass. She whispered, almost to herself, "What if we're underestimating him Richard didn't hear? He was lost in his own world, tapping his foot to the muffled beat of music only he could hear." Hours later, as the plane began its descent into Philadelphia, Emily gathered her files with meticulous care. Richard stretched lazily, as though he were arriving for a vacation instead of a federal court battle. "Ready to win?" he asked, his grin sharp. Emily forced a smile, but the question gnawed at her. Ready, yes. Confident, not entirely, because somewhere in her mind, the image of that man, with the weathered briefcase, refused to fade. The lounge at Newark Liberty International Airport was quiet compared to the chaos at the gate. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and faint traces of disinfectant mixed with the low hum of television screens showing muted news reports. Malcolm Rivers sat in a leather chair by the window, his briefcase balanced carefully on his lap. He had been offered entry to the lounge by a sympathetic ticketing agent who had witnessed the spectacle at the gate. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, sir," she had whispered as she handed him a new boarding pass for a later flight. She hadn't recognized him as a federal judge or a CEO. She had simply recognized a man treated unfairly. Malcolm had thanked her with a nod, appreciating the small kindness. Now, sitting in the lounge, he slowly opened his briefcase and checked its contents. His keynote speech, meticulously typed and annotated, his reading glasses, a collection of handwritten notes he kept for reflection lines about justice, about dignity, about what it meant to lead not just with authority, but with compassion. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling through his nose. The confrontation replayed in his mind like a film on loop. The clipped tone of Kelly Monroe, the gate agent, the sneer of Frank Doyle, the supervisor, the dismissive way they had looked at him, as if he were an inconvenience, a problem, a nobody. For a man who had spent decades navigating corporate boardrooms and federal courtrooms, the sting wasn't new. Malcolm had faced prejudice before in subtler ways, sometimes in sharper ones. But what unsettled him wasn't just the insult to him personally. It was the pattern. A system designed to see certain people as obstacles to efficiency rather than human beings with dignity. He tapped his pen against the notebook, writing a single line. "A company shows its soul in the smallest moments. The phone in his pocket buzzed softly. He pulled it out and answered. Judge Rivers, came the steady voice of Michael Torres, his longtime chief of staff. Yes. Michael? I just wanted to confirm tomorrow's schedule. Michael said, The plaintiffs are ready, and Apex Air's counsel filed a late supplement this morning. Do you still want the hearing at 9? Malcolm paused, glancing at the new boarding pass in his hand. The rebooked flight wouldn't land until after midnight. A 9:00 même. Hearing would be too tight. No, push it to 1 p.m., Malcolm said calmly. That'll give me time. And Michael, please pull Apex Air's corporate filings, officers, board members, primary legal counsel. I want them on my desk tonight. There was a short silence on the line. Of course, Judge, Michael replied, his curiosity carefully hidden behind professionalism. Thank you, Malcolm said. He hung up, staring out the window at the tarmac, where planes taxied like restless beasts. He wasn't planning revenge. He had long outgrown the luxury of pettiness. But what he had witnessed at that gate was more than poor service. It was a symptom of a culture, one that rewarded arrogance, that punished humility, that saw passengers as revenue streams instead of human lives. And tomorrow, that culture would stand trial in his courtroom. He thought of his late wife, Diana, whose voice still lingered in his memory during quiet nights. She had been the one to remind him, again and again, that his work was not about rulings or headlines. It was about people. Malcolm, she used to say, every decision you make ripples into someone's kitchen table, their mortgage, their dignity. Never forget the human face in the paperwork. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing her. That was why the humiliation at the gate struck deeper than mere inconvenience. It wasn't about his pride. It was about the countless unnamed passengers who endured the same treatment without recourse, without power, without a voice strong enough to be heard. He scribbled another note in his pad. The measure of power is how it treats the powerless. A soft chime overhead announced another departing flight. The lounge began to empty. Travelers gathering their coats and briefcases, their shoulders weighed down by deadlines and destinations. Malcolm remained still, a quiet figure amid the bustle. He considered the irony. While he sat here with delayed travel plans, Apex Air's top lawyers were likely already en route to Philadelphia, confident, unbothered, perhaps even laughing about the inconvenience of some passenger at the gate. He almost smiled at the thought. Life had a way of balancing its own scales. Notre time. Raison. Later that evening, as the lounge grew quiet again, Malcolm opened the folder containing his keynote address. It was meant for young law students at the University of Pennsylvania, a talk about the evolving meaning of justice in the 21st century. But now, after the events of the day, he began to make edits. He underlined certain lines, added new passages in the margins, about the dignity inherent in every person, about how institutions fail not when they break big promises, but when they ignore small ones, about how the most powerful lesson for future lawyers wasn't in statutes or precedents, but in empathy. His pen moved quickly, the words flowing with an urgency he hadn't felt in months. The humiliation at the gate had become fuel, shaping not anger, but clarity. He paused, staring at a line he had just written. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and utterly unshakable. Yes, that was it. The lounge attendant approached quietly. "Mr. Rivers." "Your flight is boarding at gate A19. Malcolm stood, slipping his notes back into the briefcase. He thanked her, his voice steady, his posture tall. He walked toward the gate with the same calm dignity he had carried when leaving the earlier confrontation. But this time, his step felt heavier, anchored by the knowledge that tomorrow's courtroom would be about more than a motion to dismiss. It would be about something far larger, a question of culture, of respect, of whether an institution that treated one man with such contempt could ever claim to treat all fairly. As he boarded the later flight, he didn't feel bitterness. He felt resolve. The Philadelphia evening air carried a crisp bite as Richard Coleman and Emily Carter stepped from their car and gazed up at the courthouse. Its facade of pale stone and tall glass windows caught the last hues of sunset, painting the building in shades of authority. For Richard, it looked like an arena he was destined to conquer. For Emily, it loomed more like a cathedral, heavy with unspoken judgment. Inside, the halls echoed with the shuffle of shoes and the murmur of late-night staff. Richard walked quickly, his stride sharp with arrogance. Emily trailed slightly behind, scanning the signs and notices pinned to the bulletin board outside the clerk's office. One notice caught her eye. Case 23 CV 1142, Wu et al. Vers Apex Air, Inc. Hearing rescheduled to 1 p.m. by order of Judge Malcolm Rivers. Emily's breath caught, the name familiar yet now glaring. She felt her pulse quicken. "Malcolm Rivers," she whispered under her breath. Richard was already inside the clerk's office, signing a visitor log with a flourish. He turned, smirking. "See? Just as I said. Rescheduled. Probably because the judge had a golf game this morning." Emily didn't answer. She stepped closer to the notice, staring at the neat official typeface. Judge Malcolm Rivers. The face of the man at the gate surfaced in her mind. The silver hair cropped close, the calm eyes that never wavered even when humiliated, the worn leather briefcase. No, she thought, it couldn't be. The odds were too wild, but her gut told her otherwise. "Richard," she said slowly, "I need a minute." "Don't wander off," Richard replied, adjusting his tie. "We've got to scout the courtroom. Optics matter." He strolled away, his confidence filling the hall like cologne. Emily slipped into a side alcove, pulled out her phone, and typed quickly, "Judge Malcolm Rivers." The search results appeared instantly: biographies, news articles, photos. She tapped the images, and there he was, in his judicial robes, at law conferences, at charity events, older, more formal in some photos, but unmistakable. The same man from gate C14 walking away with quiet dignity while Frank Doyle sneered. Emily's hand trembled. She whispered to herself, "Oh my God." She scrolled faster. The evidence overwhelming. Every photo confirmed the truth. The man Richard had mocked was the very judge they were about to stand before. The realization struck her chest like ice water. When she rejoined Richard in the lobby, her face was pale. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he teased, still basking in his self-assured glow. "Worse," Emily said, her voice breaking slightly. She held up her phone, the image of Rivers in his robe filling the screen. "This is him, the man at the gate, the man you laughed about." Richard's smirk faltered. He snatched the phone, squinting at the photo, then flipping through others in disbelief, his tanned face drained of color. No, that's not possible." "It's him," Emily insisted. "Think about it. The timing, the rescheduled hearing, the look he gave at the gate. It all matches." Richard leaned against a marble pillar, suddenly unsteady. His bravado cracked like glass. He replayed the memory in his mind how he had breezed past the man, tossed a dismissive joke about entitlement, and never looked back. Now, every detail mocked him. "We're finished," he whispered, almost choking. "Absolutely finished." Emily tried to steady herself. "Not if we—" "There's no fixing this," Richard snapped, his voice harsh with panic. "We mocked him. Our client's staff humiliated him, and now he's the judge on our case." His phone buzzed in his pocket. He fumbled to answer. "Patricia," he said into the receiver, "we have a situation. No forget situation. We have a catastrophe." Back at Apex Air's headquarters in Chicago, General Counsel Patricia Langston was in a conference room with her legal team. At first, her voice was cool, controlled, but as Richard explained, her composure began to crack. "You're telling me," Patricia said slowly, "that our gate staff publicly humiliated Judge Rivers this morning, and that our lawyers— You saw it happen." Richard's throat tightened. "Yes, we didn't realize who he was." There was silence on the line, then the sound of Patricia exhaling sharply. "Do you have any idea what this means? Our entire defense hinges on credibility, on the idea that our policies are clear and applied fairly. And the one person who decides that question has personally experienced the opposite." Emily could hear Patricia's voice through the phone, cold and furious. "I want names," Patricia said. "Gate agent, supervisor. I want their reports, the footage, everything. Do you understand?" "Yes," Richard croaked. Patricia didn't soften. "This isn't a legal problem anymore. This is an existential crisis. The judge doesn't need to break ethics to destroy us. All he has to do is ask one question we cannot answer honestly, and he will." The call ended abruptly. Richard's hand shook as he lowered the phone. Emily sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the courthouse floor tiles, each one suddenly heavy as stone. Namai Seim Idur. Later, alone in her hotel room, Emily sat at the desk, staring at her notes. She had highlighted dozens of arguments, contract clauses, precedents, case law, but every page now felt flimsy, irrelevant. She whispered into the empty room, "How do you argue fairness to a man who's just lived the proof of unfairness?" For the first time in her career, she realized the law wasn't just words on paper. It was flesh and bone, humiliation and dignity, silence and memory. And tomorrow, it would all come crashing into their case. The conference room at Apex Air's headquarters in Chicago was normally a place of confident strategy. Glass walls, gleaming tables, and a skyline view usually set the stage for executives to speak in polished tones about quarterly earnings and expansion plans. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was suffocating. Patricia Langston stood at the head of the table, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her phone lay face down beside her legal pad, as though she could crush the disastrous news it had just carried by sheer force of will. Around the table, the senior leadership team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Thomas Greer, the airline CEO, usually carried the room with his booming voice and trademark smile. But tonight his tan face was pale, his jaw tight. He stared at the city lights outside the window, as if looking for an escape route. "Let me make sure I understand this," he said finally, his voice low. "This morning, at Newark Liberty, our staff denied boarding to a passenger because of a bag dispute. That passenger turned out to be the federal judge presiding over our $100 million case. Is that correct?" "Yes," Patricia answered, her tone clipped. And our lawyers saw it happen. Thomas continued, his voice rising, and they, what, did nothing. They didn't realize who he was. Patricia said, "They walked right past him." The room went silent. The executives shifted, papers rustling like nervous whispers. Patricia tapped a button on the remote control. A large screen flickered to life, showing grainy security footage from Gate C-14. The room watched as Malcolm Rivers approached the podium with his boarding pass. They saw Kelly Monroe gesture sharply at his briefcase. They saw Frank Doyle lean into Malcolm's space, his finger stabbing the air like a weapon. They saw Malcolm's calm refusal, his dignified retreat. And then they saw the most damning moment: Richard Coleman and Emily Carter, OPEC's own lawyers, striding past Rivers with first-class passes in hand, greeted with deference as he walked away. The silence in the conference room deepened into something unbearable. "My God," murmured one executive, "it looks like a morality play. It looks," Patricia corrected, "like Exhibit A in a lawsuit about corporate arrogance." Thomas Greer slammed his fist against the table. "Who wrote the incident report?" Patricia tapped another key. A PDF appeared on the screen. Frank Doyle's words glowed in black and white. Passenger Rivers became belligerent and disruptive, refused to comply, was verbally abusive, denied boarding to ensure safety. Thomas read it twice, his voice shaking. "He lied." "Of course he lied," Patricia said, her voice like ice. "He tried to protect himself, but in doing so, he just signed our death warrant. Because when that report is compared to this video, the entire case against us collapses. Our credibility is gone." The head of public relations, a slim woman named Karen Holt, spoke up nervously. We can try to contain this. If it leaks, we say it was a misunderstanding, that we've already addressed it internally. People forget stories in a week." Patricia turned on her, sharp. "This is not about headlines. This is about tomorrow in a courtroom. Judge Rivers doesn't need the press. He doesn't need to raise his voice. All he has to do is ask us one question. Are your policies applied fairly and uniformly? And we cannot answer yes without lying to his face. He knows it." The words hung heavy. No one moved. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "So what are our options?" "There are no good ones," Patricia replied. "We could ask for recusal, but on what grounds? That our own employees mistreated the judge? That would be suicide. We could try to settle, but at this stage it will cost us more than we ever budgeted." The CFO spoke up, voice tight. "More than $100 million. Easily," Patricia said. "And that's just money. The cultural damage, the regulatory scrutiny, the stock hit. It could break this company." Thomas swallowed hard. His empire, the airline he had built with swagger and expansion, was teetering because of a single incident at a gate. Patricia's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Langston here," she answered. On the other end, Richard Coleman's voice came through, shaking. "Patricia, he knows. I'm telling you, he knows everything." He looked right at me. "Stop!" Patricia interrupted. "Do not say another word about it on this line. Prepare for court tomorrow. Be professional, be humble, and pray." She hung up without ceremony. The room stared at her. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked again, almost pleading. Patricia looked around the table, her expression hard. "We start cutting out the rot. Kelly Monroe and Frank Doyle suspend them immediately pending termination. And when this is over, we overhaul the entire gate operations system, training, incentives, everything. We've built a culture that punishes dignity and rewards hostility. And tonight, that culture has come for us. Karen Holt scribbled notes furiously, already drafting statements in her head. Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I never thought, he murmured, that the future of this company would come down to a briefcase at a gate. Patricia's reply was soft, almost grim. It always comes down to the small things. That's where respect lives or dies. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the Chicago skyline sparkled as though nothing had changed. Inside, Apex Air's leadership sat trapped in the knowledge that tomorrow, their empire might crumble, not because of a complex legal argument, but because one man's dignity had been dismissed as an inconvenience. For the first time in her long career, Patricia felt the weight of inevitability pressing on her chest. Judge Rivers would not need anger or theatrics. His silence alone could unravel them, and there was no strategy, no press release, no power play that could save them from that. Morning in Philadelphia dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on the city like a lid. Outside the federal courthouse, the steps were slick from a light rain, glistening under the boots of lawyers, journalists, and nervous clients. Reporters lingered with cameras, hoping for sound bites. Inside, the air was taut with expectation. Emily Carter adjusted her blazer as she stood outside Courtroom 12B, clutching her binder so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Richard Coleman paced beside her, his eyes darting, his face pale. Gone was the swagger he carried through airports and boardrooms. He looked more like a man waiting for a verdict than preparing to argue one. "This is bad," he muttered for the 100th time. "We should have pulled the motion. We should have begged for settlement." Patricia said no sudden moves. Emily reminded him quietly. Though her voice lacked conviction, she said it would make things worse. Richard let out a strangled laugh. "Worse than this. We're about to stand in front of a man who watched our client humiliate him. He knows exactly what we are." The heavy oak doors opened. A clerk motioned them inside. The courtroom was already filling. On the plaintiff's side sat Daniel Wu and his team, calm but focused, shuffling papers and whispering in low tones. Across the aisle, Apex Air's executives, including Patricia Langston and Thomas Greer, slipped into the gallery seats, their faces drawn tight. They looked less like leaders of a billion-dollar company and more like defendants awaiting sentencing. Emily and Richard settled at the defense table, their files stacked neatly, though neither of them could focus. The hum of the room quieted as the bailiff's voice cut through. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Malcolm Rivers presiding. The doors behind the bench opened, and Malcolm entered, draped in his black robe. His step was measured, his face composed, his eyes calm. To the casual observer, he was every bit the impartial judge. But to Richard and Emily, it was like watching a storm given human form silent, immense, inevitable. He took his seat. The room followed. "Be seated," he said, his voice resonant and steady. Emily dared to glance up. His expression betrayed nothing. No flicker of recognition, no hint of the humiliation he had endured at Newark. Just neutrality, the kind that terrified her more than open anger ever could. "We are here," Malcolm said, "on case number 23 CV 1142 Wu et al. Versus Apex Air Incorporated, to hear arguments on the defendant's motion to dismiss. Counsel, you may begin." Richard rose, his legs unsteady. He gripped the lectern, his notes trembling in his hand. "May it please the court," he began, his voice cracking before he cleared his throat. "Richard Coleman for the defendant, Apex Air. Your Honor, Our motion rests on the clarity of the contract between the airline and its passengers. The terms of service are explicit, and by purchasing a ticket, each passenger, Malcolm raised a hand. Mr. Coleman, he interrupted gently, a question before you proceed. Richard froze. Yes, Your Honor. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. Is it your assertion that Apex Air applies its stated policies fairly and uniformly to all passengers? The question was simple, almost benign, but Emily felt her chest seize. She knew it was the dagger. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced down at his notes, but the words blurred into nonsense. He looked back at the bench. Malcolm's gaze was steady, neither hostile nor forgiving, just watching, waiting. Yes, Your Honor, Richard stammered finally. That is our position. The silence that followed was devastating. Malcolm made a small, deliberate note on his pad. His face remained unreadable, but the message was clear he knew. Richard's confidence evaporated. He stumbled through the rest of his argument, citing case law in a disjointed rhythm, each sentence thinner than the last. He tried to summon his usual bravado, but it rang hollow, his voice catching on the weight of the truth sitting silently between him and the bench. When at last he finished, his throat was dry, his shirt damp with sweat. Thank you. Mr. Coleman, Malcolm said evenly. Plaintiff's counsel. Daniel Wu rose with quiet assurance. He didn't attack Richard's points directly. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke of passengers blindsided by hidden fees, of families forced to pay unexpected charges at the gate, of a corporate culture that treated customers not as people, but as opportunities for extraction. This case, Your Honor, Daniel concluded, is not only about contracts. It is about dignity, and whether an airline that cannot apply its own policies consistently can ever be trusted to do right by the people it serves. The words landed heavy in the room. Emily swallowed hard. She thought of Malcolm at the gate, standing quietly as Frank Doyle barked at him, as Kelly Monroe dismissed his explanations. Daniel didn't know it, but he had just described the very scene that haunted her. Malcolm listened without interruption. His face betrayed nothing. When Daniel finished, the judge glanced at the clock. The court has heard arguments from both sides. Malcolm said, I will take the motion under advisement and issue a written ruling in due course. Court is adjourned. The gavel cracked once, sharp and final. The room erupted into murmurs as people stood. Richard slumped into his chair, defeated. Emily packed the files quietly, her hands trembling. Across the aisle, Daniel Wu exchanged calm nods with his team. Malcolm rose, his robe trailing behind him as he left the bench. He never looked at Richard. He never looked at Emily. He didn't need to. His silence had already done more than words ever could. Outside the courthouse, the drizzle had turned into steady rain. Reporters gathered, microphones raised, but Patricia Langston brushed them off with a terse no comment. She shepherded Thomas Greer and the others into waiting cars. Inside, Richard sat alone in the empty courtroom, staring at the lectern where he had faltered. His career, his reputation, his certainty, it all felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Emily touched his shoulder lightly. Richard, let's go. He didn't move. His voice came out as a hoarse whisper. He didn't have to say a word. He destroyed us by being perfect. Emily nodded slowly, the truth settling heavy in her chest. The quiet professionalism of Malcolm Rivers had been more damning than any outburst could ever be. The silence after the hearing lingered long into the evening. For Apex Air's defense team, every tick of the clock felt like a countdown to collapse. By the time Richard Coleman and Emily Carter returned to their hotel, the The weight of inevitability hung so heavy that even Richard's usual bravado had vanished completely. He sat hunched in a chair, his tie loosened, staring at the carpet. Emily quietly spread her notes across the desk, though she knew they were useless now. Hours later, Patricia Langston called them into a secure video conference. Her image filled the laptop screen, the sharp light of her office in Chicago casting long shadows behind her. Thomas Greer was seated next to her, face ashen, hands folded tightly. "Let's not waste time," Patricia said flatly. "We're finished in court. Judge Rivers won't need to write a long ruling. He already gutted our position with one question." Richard's throat tightened. "Patricia." "I don't," she cut in, her tone razor sharp. "Don't try to spin this." You couldn't answer him because the truth was obvious. And now, if we drag this fight out, he'll put it in writing. That's something we cannot afford. Emily swallowed, her voice quiet. "So what do we do?" Patricia looked directly at her. "We settle. Immediately." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his voice breaking into the discussion. "How much are we talking?" Patricia's eyes hardened. "More than you want to hear, but less than losing $100 million class action at trial, plus the public fallout of being called out by a federal judge who has personally experienced your failures." Richard finally found his voice. "The plaintiffs will push hard. They'll know we're desperate. That's why we won't haggle," Patricia said. "We go in high, we buy silence, we buy speed, and we buy survival." Emily hesitated. "Will that even work Judge Rivers? He doesn't seem like the kind of man who can be bought off by a big number." Patricia gave her a thin smile. "We're not buying him. We're buying the plaintiffs. Judge Rivers doesn't need to punish us with headlines. He already punished us in silence. Now it's about limiting the damage." The next morning, Patricia personally reached out to Daniel Wu. Her call was short and without pretense. She laid a number on the table that made Daniel's eyebrows rise a settlement figure so large it exceeded the plaintiff's own hopes. She added coverage of legal fees, a promise to simplify the airline's booking process, and a public apology to passengers for a lack of clarity in policy enforcement. Daniel didn't haggle. He didn't need to. He simply said, "We accept." For his clients, it was a victory beyond expectation. For Apex Air, it was surrender disguised as pragmatism. By the end of the week, the settlement papers were signed. Judge Rivers issued a one-page order dismissing the motion as moot, dry and technical, without a trace of emotion. There was no mention of Newark, no allusion to humiliation at the gate. On the record, it was just another resolved case. But everyone who had been in that courtroom knew the truth. The scales of justice had already balanced themselves. At Apex headquarters, the fallout was brutal. Kelly Monroe and Frank Doyle were terminated, not officially for mistreating a federal judge, but for falsifying reports and for a pattern of complaints that the company could no longer ignore. Their names became a warning whispered in training seminars, the agents who cost the airline millions. Patricia forced through an internal overhaul. Gate agent incentives tied to bag fees were eliminated. Customer service protocols were rewritten to emphasize respect over speed. The words dignity and fairness appeared in memos and training videos, though many employees rolled their eyes, suspecting it was just corporate theater. Still, the reforms had weight behind them now. Thomas Greer faced his own reckoning. Shareholders demanded accountability. His once booming confidence faltered under the scrutiny of those who had cheered his relentless cost-cutting when it fattened margins, but now blamed him for creating the culture that had nearly destroyed the company. He survived, but diminished. His empire dented by a single incident he could never fully explain away. Richard Coleman's career at Sterling and Finch was equally scarred. Though the firm didn't fire him, the story spread in whispers through legal circles. He was the man who had stood in front of Judge Rivers and crumbled, who hadn't recognized the judge at the gate, who had mocked him. Partners looked at him differently. His path to leadership closed. Emily Carter, however, found something unexpected. The experience reshaped her. She no longer saw law as lines on paper, but as something beating and fragile in the lives of people. She remembered the way Rivers had walked away from the gate, not with fury, but with quiet resolve. She carried that image into her own practice, approaching every case with sharper empathy, more careful preparation, and a new kind of strength. As for Malcolm Rivers, he never spoke of Newark. He gave his keynote at the University of Pennsylvania as planned, his words resonating through the hall. He talked of the law not as an abstract structure, but as a living practice that demanded humility. He ended with a line he had recently written in his notes. The law is not just statutes and precedents. At its heart, it is about people, and every person you meet, whether in a courtroom or at a boarding gate, deserves dignity. The students applauded, some even standing. But Malcolm did not bask in their praise. He simply closed his folder, nodded, and stepped away from the podium. In the quiet of his chambers weeks later, he reflected on the storm. Apex Air had survived, though changed. The plaintiffs had won more than they expected. His own dignity had remained intact, and he had once again been reminded of his wife's words. Never forget the human face in the paperwork. For Malcolm, that was justice not loud, not vengeful, but steady, deliberate, and unshakable. In the weeks that followed the settlement, the story of Wu et al. V. Apex Air did not make headlines. There were no viral clips of the courtroom exchange, no dramatic news packages about the downfall of an airline giant. Apex legal team and public relations machine ensured the details stayed quiet, buried beneath the usual churn of industry updates and market reports. But silence did not mean the story had no impact. Within the airline, whispers traveled faster than any press release. Gate agents in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles heard about Kelly Monroe and Frank Doyle's abrupt termination. The official reason listed was falsifying records and poor conduct, but employees traded the fuller version like a ghost story they had humiliated a man at a gate who turned out to be the judge on Apex's biggest lawsuit. Some agents laughed nervously, dismissing it as rumor. Others shook their heads, wondering if every passenger they faced might secretly hold power over their futures. A new caution spread, not born of compassion, but of fear. Yet for some, the story cut deeper. A handful of agents began to soften their tone with customers, to pause before escalating disputes, to see the humans beyond the tickets. At the executive level, the ripple was sharper. Thomas Greer found himself summoned repeatedly to shareholder meetings where his once celebrated aggressiveness was now framed as recklessness. He gave long, carefully prepared speeches about reform, about Apex's new commitment to dignity and fairness, but the sparkle in his eyes had dulled. Behind closed doors, he confided to Patricia Langston that he no longer slept through the night. He replayed the settlement figures in his mind, each zero like a stone pressing down on his chest. Patricia, for her part, became more feared than ever. Her decisive handling of the crisis kept Apex from collapse, but her cold efficiency frightened colleagues. She was the woman who had stared down disaster and refused to blink. She carried the reputation of someone who had seen the abyss and dragged the company back. But at the cost of whatever warmth had remained in her leadership, for Richard Coleman, The ripples were personal and brutal. He returned to Sterling and Finch, but his reputation carried the stink of failure. His colleagues avoided mentioning the case outright, but their eyes said everything. He was no longer invited to client dinners. His name was quietly removed from key accounts. Late at night, he sat in his office staring at the skyline, a glass of whiskey in hand, whispering the same words over and over. One question. One question destroyed me. Emily Carter, however, felt herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. She replayed the hearing in her mind. The calm authority of Judge Rivers, the way he dismantled their defense without a raised voice. More than anything, she remembered his silence at the gate, his refusal to descend to anger even when insulted. That image stayed with her, reshaping her approach to her work. She began volunteering her time at a local legal aid clinic, offering free counsel to low-income clients. Now, she told herself it was just to stay sharp, but deep down, she knew it was something more. She needed to balance the scales inside herself, to honor the lesson she had witnessed. Meanwhile, Daniel Wu became something of a quiet hero among his peers. The size of the settlement lifted his clients and validated his patient, deliberate style of advocacy. Younger lawyers asked him how he had managed to stand so calmly in front of Judge Rivers, how he had known exactly what to say. Daniel only smiled and said, "Sometimes the judge tells the story for you." And through it all, Malcolm Rivers continued his work, unchanged on the surface but carrying the echoes of Newark within him. He presided over cases with the same calm demeanor, his rulings sharp and precise. Yet when attorneys stepped before him with arrogance or dismissiveness, his questions cut deeper, exposing flaws they hadn't prepared for. He did not raise his voice. He did not lecture. He simply asked, and in his questions, the truth revealed itself. One evening, weeks after the settlement, Malcolm walked through his neighborhood in Philadelphia, the autumn air crisp and smelling faintly of wood smoke. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jackson, stopped him on the sidewalk. "Judge Rivers," she said warmly, "I saw your speech at the university online. Beautiful words. You make us proud." Malcolm smiled softly. "Thank you. Mrs. Jackson?" She reached out, patting his arm. "Don't you forget. Now, the world doesn't change from big cases and big money. It changes from the little moments. How you treat a man at a gate. How you treat a woman at a counter. That's where the real law lives." Her words lingered with him long after she walked away. They echoed the notes he had scribbled in the airport lounge. A company shows its soul in the smallest moments. Back in his study that night, Malcolm opened his leather notebook and added a line beneath it, "And so does a person." The ripple effects of that day at Newark were not measured only in dollars or policies. They were measured in sleepless nights, in whispered warnings, in reshaped careers, in students inspired, in quiet moments of reflection that shifted the course of lives. The gate had been small, but the echo reached far months later. The Peterson v. Apex settlement was yesterday's news in the corporate world, but in legal and academic circles, it had become a quiet parable. Law students at Penn, Columbia, and Georgetown whispered about the Gate C-27 case, though no transcript revealed its full story. Professors hinted at it in lectures about ethics and corporate culture, how the smallest interaction can decide the fate of the largest battles. At Apex headquarters, reforms were rolled out with glossy brochures and upbeat slogans. Respect in every interaction, every customer matters. New training programs appeared. Supervisors were instructed to prioritize empathy over efficiency, but many employees wondered if the changes were real, or if they were simply another coat of paint on the same corroded frame. Thomas Greer gave press interviews, his voice measured, his words chosen with surgical precision. He framed Apex as a company humbled, ready to listen, reborn. Yet behind the polished speeches, investors remained restless. Settlements could be paid, reputations could be patched, but the memory of near catastrophe hung over the boardroom like a phantom. Richard Coleman sat in his corner office, but he no longer commanded respect. He still had his title, but it was stripped of meaning. His calls went unanswered, his calendar empty. He had gone from being a star to a cautionary tale. His arrogance had once felt like armor. Now it was a weight he carried alone. Emily Carter, meanwhile, found herself on a different path. She began to draw clients of her own, not corporations seeking loopholes, but individuals seeking fairness. She represented tenants fighting unjust evictions, immigrants facing confusing paperwork, families trying to navigate an unforgiving system. Each case reminded her of Newark, of Judge Rivers, of the weight of dignity. She had started as Richard's shadow. Now she was stepping into her own light. Daniel Wu continued his quiet advocacy. He was invited to conferences, panels, and podcasts. He spoke not only about the case, but about the larger lessons it carried: the need for corporations to rediscover humanity, the duty of lawyers to remember they serve people, not just clients. His words spread not with bombast, but with sincerity, and they reached ears ready to hear. And then there was Judge Malcolm Rivers. He remained on the bench, steady as stone, impartial as the scales carved into the courthouse doors. To the outside world, he was unchanged. His rulings remained meticulous, his demeanor unshaken, but those who listened closely to his speeches, to the rare interviews he granted, noticed a subtle shift. He began to speak more openly about dignity, about the law as a living force that extends beyond statutes and into daily life. He told young lawyers, "Never underestimate the smallest exchange. The law is not just in the courtroom, it's in how you speak to a clerk, how you wait in line, how you treat the person who has no power over you." At the University of Pennsylvania, when he gave his keynote address the following spring, the auditorium was packed. Students, professors, even members of the public filled the rows. His words carried the weight of a man who had lived what he spoke. The measure of justice is not only found in written opinions or landmark rulings. It is found in the quiet, invisible moments when no one is watching, when you decide whether to listen, whether to extend respect, whether to see another person as fully human. I urge you all carry the law with you in those moments, because you never know who you are speaking to. And more importantly, you never know what kind of future you are shaping. The room rose in applause. Not a thunderous, fleeting cheer, but a steady, heartfelt, standing ovation. Students left the hall speaking not just of precedent, but of purpose. That night, as Malcolm walked home through the tree-lined streets, he reflected not on Apex, not on the humiliation at Newark, not even on the victory of the settlement. He thought of his late wife, of her quiet reminders that kindness is never wasted. He thought of his grandmother, who had once told him as a boy, "The world will try to make you small. Malcolm, never let it, but also never make someone else small." Her words echoed in his mind as he reached his front porch. He paused, looking up at the night sky, its stars scattered like the scales of justice themselves. He realized then that the true legacy of Newark was not the downfall of an arrogant lawyer, nor the millions paid in settlement. It was the reminder etched into his very soul that dignity is the law's first principle and its last. The story of that day at the gate would never be written in legal textbooks, but it lived in whispers, in classrooms, in the changed hearts of those who had witnessed it. It lived in Emily's choice to fight for the powerless. It lived in Daniel's insistence on humanity in every case. It lived in the softened voices of gate agents who, for once, thought twice before barking at a weary traveler. And it lived in Malcolm himself, not as bitterness, but as fuel, a reminder of why he had chosen the law in the first place. Not to win, not to punish, but to remind the world of its shared humanity. The scales of justice balanced quietly that day, not in a ruling, not in a headline, but in the unseen shift of hearts. And perhaps, Malcolm thought as he closed his front door behind him, that was the greatest judgment of all. The story of Judge Malcolm Rivers is more than a courtroom drama. It's a reminder that dignity is never optional. What happened at that airport gate shows us that the true test of character lies in how we treat those who seem to hold no power over us. The gate agent and supervisor saw only an ordinary black man they believed they could dismiss. They didn't see the human being in front of them, nor could they imagine the weight he carried in his role as a judge. In life, each of us encounters moments like this not in grand settings, but in small exchanges. Do we listen with respect? Do we act with patience? Or do we let arrogance and assumptions guide us? Judge Rivers did not lash out. He carried himself with quiet strength and let justice speak in its own time. For older audiences especially, this lesson resonates. We've seen the world change. But one truth endures: respect costs nothing, yet it can transform everything. Whether in families, workplaces, or communities, dignity must always come first, because we never truly know who we're speaking to or what impact our words and actions may carry into tomorrow. Thank you so much for spending time with us and walking through this powerful story. If it moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need the reminder, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing stories of dignity, justice, and hope to life.